He stepped into that elevator thinking he was in control of everything, until he saw the woman who had defined his past and a little boy who would change his life forever. If you love stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We post new content every day. And now back to our story. The elevator at the Waldorf Astoria had just reached the ground floor when Edward Thompson adjusted the cuff of his Italian designer shirt and checked the Rolex on his wrist. At 42, with salt and pepper hair at his temples that only accentuated his natural elegance, he was the kind of man who commanded boardrooms with a single glance. As the owner of one of New York City's largest construction firms, Edward had turned his family name into a synonym for luxury and exclusivity in the city's real estate market. At his side, Victoria Prescott radiated the calculated perfection of someone born into the upper crust of high society. Blonde, sculpted by the city's top plastic surgeons, she wore a Valentino dress that cost more than most cars. The engagement ring on her finger was a work of art in diamonds, a symbol of a relationship that functioned more like a corporate merger than true love. They had been together for 8 months, long enough for the society pages to crown them the couple of the year. Dinner with the Hamiltons was a success, Victoria said, touching up her Chanel lipstick in the elevator's mirror. I'm sure they'll agree to invest in the Westchester project. Edward nodded distractedly. Business always came first, and Victoria understood that better than any woman he had ever been with. She didn't ask inconvenient questions, didn't demand emotional availability, and most importantly, never questioned his professional decisions. She was the kind of partner he believed he needed at this stage of his life. The elevator doors were almost closed when a woman's voice echoed from the lobby, "Hold on, please." Edward, out of reflex, stuck his hand out to stop the doors from shutting completely. It was an automatic, polite gesture, of no real consequence, or so it should have been. When the doors slid open again, the world stopped. Mariah Davis was standing there, at the entrance to the elevator, with a small boy by her side. Edward's heart plummeted as if the floor had been ripped out from under him. For an infinite moment he forgot how to breathe. She was more beautiful than he remembered, and that was both wonderful and devastating. Her brown hair, once always tied back in practical buns, now fell in loose, natural waves over her shoulders. Her green eyes, which had once made him believe in happy endings, still had that intensity that completely unraveled him. But there was something different in them now, a maturity, a strength that hadn't been there 2.5 years ago. Mariah hesitated for a fraction of a second upon seeing him, as if calculating whether to get in or not. But the boy beside her, as impatient as any 2.5-year-old, pulled her hand toward the elevator. "Mommy, let's go up," the little boy said, with the typical excitement of a child who saw elevators as giant toys. The word "mommy" hit Edward like a punch to the gut. His eyes automatically fixed on the child, and that's when his world completely fell apart. The boy had his eyes. Not a distant resemblance, not a fleeting impression. They were Edward Thompson's eyes, staring right back at him from the innocent face of a child. The dark, wavy hair, the shape of his nose, the line of his brow. Every feature screamed a truth that no one needed to say out loud. Gabriel, because that's what Mariah had called him during the few seconds before the deafening silence, was his son. Mariah? Edward's voice came out hoarser than he would have liked. Victoria, beside him, immediately sensed that something was wrong. Very wrong. Mariah stepped into the elevator with Gabriel, keeping as much distance as possible from Edward. Her fingers involuntarily tightened around her son's hand, as if to protect him from an invisible danger. "Edward," she replied, with a polite coldness that cut deeper than any shout. "Victoria?" she added, greeting his fiancée with a nod. The silence that followed was thick with tensions that Victoria couldn't fully comprehend but could feel in her bones. Edward was frozen, his gaze shifting between Mariah and Gabriel, as if trying to process a reality that defied everything he thought he knew about his own life. Gabriel, oblivious to the emotional storm swirling around the adults, pressed the button for the 10th floor and smiled, pleased with his small achievement. "Mommy, I pushed it all by myself." "Good job, sweetheart," Mariah replied, and Edward felt a pang of something he couldn't name as he heard the affection in her voice directed at the boy. Victoria broke the awkward silence. "Do you two know each other?" The question was innocent, but loaded with implications. Edward felt sweat bead on his forehead. How could he explain to his fiancée that the woman standing a few feet away was the only person who had ever truly loved him? And how could he explain that they apparently had a son together? "Mariah is an architect," Edward managed to say, his voice sounding strangely formal. "We worked together a few years ago." It was a partial truth, almost a lie. They had been married for 3 years. Mariah had been the only woman who had managed to see past the facade of success and touch the man behind the tycoon, and Edward had thrown it all away out of pride, immaturity, and a destructive inability to handle vulnerability. Mariah didn't correct his incomplete statement. She just kept her eyes fixed on the floor numbers, changing slowly on the digital display. Every second seemed to last an eternity. The elevator stopped on the 8th floor and Victoria stepped out. "I'll see you at home later," she said, kissing Edward's cheek. But even a casual observer would have noticed that something in their dynamic had shifted in those few minutes. When the doors closed again, leaving only Edward, Mariah, and Gabriel inside the small space, the silence became almost unbearable. "How old is he?" Edward asked, though he already knew the answer. His voice was low, careful, as if he were walking through a minefield. 2.5, Mariah answered without looking at him. Edward closed his eyes for a moment. 2.5 years. Exactly the amount of time since they had separated. The math was too simple, too painful. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" The question came out laced with a mixture of anger, pain, and desperation that Edward didn't know he still carried inside him. Mariah finally turned to look him in the eye, and for a moment he saw the wounded woman she had been during the last months of their marriage. "Do you really want me to answer that here, in front of him?" she whispered, gesturing toward Gabriel with her eyes. The boy was busy playing with the elevator buttons, completely absorbed in his own little world. But Mariah was right. This was not the time or the place for this conversation. The elevator reached the 10th floor, and Mariah took Gabriel's hand. "Come on, honey." Before leaving, she turned to Edward one last time. "If you want to talk, I'm in suite 1024. But only if you come alone, and only if you really want to hear what I have to say." The doors closed, and Edward was left alone with the echo of his own heartbeat and the weight of a revelation that would change everything. He had a son he had never met, who had grown up without him, who called someone else family. Guilt washed over him like a wave, quickly followed by anger at having been deprived of 2.5 years of Gabriel's life. But beneath all those emotions was something even more powerful, a desperate urge to know the boy, to be part of his life, to understand how this had all happened. For 20 minutes, Edward stood motionless in the hotel lobby, trying to process what had just occurred. People passed by, conversations buzzed around him, but none of it registered. His mind was completely consumed by the image of Gabriel, his own eyes looking back at him from the face of a child who was half him and half the only woman he had ever truly loved. When he finally managed to move, Edward knew there was only one thing to do. He had to go up to the 10th floor. He needed to hear the truth, no matter how painful it might be. He needed to understand how he had lost the first 2.5 years of his son's life, and most importantly, he needed to find out if there was still a chance to make up for lost time. The walk to the elevator felt endless. Each step carried the weight of past choices, of words left unsaid, of squandered opportunities. Edward knew that when those doors opened again on the 10th floor, his life would change forever. The question that terrified him was, for better or for worse? He pressed the call button, and as he waited, he allowed himself to feel something he had buried 2.5 years ago. Longing. Longing for Mariah, longing for the family they could have been, and now, surprisingly, longing for a son he hadn't even known existed until a few minutes ago. The elevator doors opened, and Edward stepped inside, knowing there was no turning back. Some truths, once revealed, could not be forgotten, and some chances for redemption only come once in a lifetime. He pressed the button for the 10th floor and prayed it wasn't too late. Edward stood in front of the door to Suite 1024 for several long minutes before he could bring himself to knock. From the other side he could hear Mariah's melodic voice talking to Gabriel, probably trying to entertain him with a toy or a story. The sound was both familiar and strange. Familiar because it was the same voice that had soothed him on difficult nights during their 3-year marriage. Strange because it now carried a maternal quality he had completely missed out on. When he finally rang the doorbell, the silence that followed was heavy. Edward could almost feel Mariah hesitating on the other side, likely wondering if opening that door was worth the risk of reopening wounds that hadn't fully healed. "Mommy, someone's at the door," Gabriel shouted with the natural excitement of a child. "I know, sweetie. Go play with your cars while Mommy talks to someone, okay?" The door opened, and Mariah was there, closer than she had been in 2.5 years. She had changed out of her dress into jeans and a simple cotton blouse, and Edward remembered how beautiful she looked even in the most basic clothes. There was always a natural elegance about her that didn't depend on designer labels or expensive jewelry. "You came," she said, as if she hadn't been sure it would actually happen. "I had to." Mariah stepped aside to let him in. The suite was modest but cozy, decorated with the good taste Edward knew well. There were plants on the windowsills, books scattered on the coffee table, and, spread across the living room floor, dozens of colorful toys that transformed the formal space into something clearly inhabited by a child. Gabriel was sitting on the rug, focused on lining up a row of colorful cars. When he saw Edward walk in, the boy looked up with curiosity. "Hi," Gabriel said simply, without shyness or discomfort. "You're the man from the elevator." Edward's heart clenched. "Hi, Gabriel. I'm Edward." "Edward," the boy repeated, testing the name on his tongue. "Do you want to play cars with me?" Mariah quickly intervened. "Gabe, Lucas's dad is coming to pick you up in an hour to go to the park, remember? Why don't you organize your toys while you wait?" Edward noticed how she had skillfully diverted Gabriel's attention from their interaction. It was clear she didn't want the boy to witness a conversation that promised to be difficult. "Let's talk on the balcony," Mariah suggested, gesturing to the glass door that led to a small outdoor area. The balcony overlooked Park Avenue, and below the life of New York City carried on at its usual frantic pace. Cars, people, the constant motion of a city that never stopped. But up there, in that small space, time seemed suspended between them. Edward leaned against the railing and looked at Mariah. She stood with her arms crossed, clearly on the defensive, but there was a vulnerability in her posture that reminded him of the woman he had known years ago. "Why didn't you ever tell me you were pregnant?" he asked directly. There was no more time for beating around the bush. Mariah took a deep breath, as if preparing to dive into deep water. "Because when I found out, you had already decided you didn't want to try anymore." The answer hit Edward like a slap. "What does that mean?" "It means that when I took the pregnancy test, you had already told me our marriage was over. You had already decided I was too dependent, that I was getting in the way of your business, that it was better for us to go our separate ways." Edward vaguely remembered that conversation, but at the time it had just been one argument among many. "We argued a lot, Mariah. That didn't mean I wanted a divorce." "No?" She turned to face him, and Edward saw tears welling in her eyes. "Edward, you told me, word for word, that I was a weight holding you down. You said you married me on impulse, and that you regretted it. You said I couldn't understand you because I didn't come from the same world as you." The words came flooding back to Edward's memory like a painful cascade. He had said all of that during a terrible fight, after a dinner with investors where Mariah had publicly questioned his decision on a controversial project. At the time, Edward felt she had embarrassed him in front of important people. Now, years later, he could recognize that she had simply expressed a legitimate concern about environmental sustainability. "I was angry," he whispered. "I didn't mean it." "But you said it. And when you tell someone they're a weight in your life, Edward, when you say you married them on impulse and regret it, that person doesn't come home and tell you they're pregnant. Not when they know the news might be received as just another problem to be solved." Edward felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. "You thought I would see our child as a problem. I thought you would see me as someone trying to trap you with a pregnancy. You had made it very clear that you felt suffocated in our marriage." The silence that followed was heavy with mutual regrets. Edward looked out at the city below, trying to process how his impulsive words had cost him 2.5 years of his son's life. "And after Gabriel was born?" he asked. "Why didn't you contact me then?" Mariah laughed bitterly. "Edward, do you know how many times I picked up the phone to call you? How many times I started typing a text? But every time I remembered how you reacted when I needed you during my most important project, how you couldn't support me when I was vulnerable. And I thought, if he couldn't be there for me when all I needed was understanding, how is he going to be there for a child?" Edward remembered the project she was referring to perfectly. Mariah had won a competition to design a sustainable housing complex, the biggest job of her career at that point. But the client was notoriously difficult, making constant changes and questioning every decision. Mariah would come home exhausted and stressed, needing only someone to listen and reassure her. Instead, Edward had suggested she drop the project. "Why all this stress? You don't need to work," he had said. In his mind, he was being protective. In reality, he had been condescending and had completely invalidated the importance of her career. "I was trying to protect you," he said weakly. "You were trying to control me." "There's a difference," Mariah replied. "And I realized that if I told you about the pregnancy and the emotional state you were in, there were 2 possibilities. Either you would reject the child, or you would try to take complete control of the situation. Neither of those options seemed healthy to me." Edward ran his hands through his hair, frustrated. "So you just decided I didn't deserve to know I was going to be a father?" "I decided my son deserved a father who was actually ready to be one, not someone who would see fatherhood as another inconvenient responsibility. And you thought you had the right to make that decision. For me?" The question came out more aggressively than Edward intended, and Mariah flinched slightly. But then she composed herself and faced him with a firmness he recognized immediately. "I had the right to protect my son from someone who wasn't emotionally available. Edward, you were so consumed by your business that you would forget to eat. How many times did you come home after midnight? How many times did you cancel our plans because a more important meeting came up?" Edward knew she was right, but that didn't make it any less painful. "People change, Mariah. I could have changed." "Could you have? Or are you just saying that now because you found out you have a son?" she challenged him. "Tell me something, Edward. If Gabriel didn't exist, if I were just your ex-wife you happened to run into in an elevator, would you be here asking for a second chance? Or would you go back to your perfect fiancée and your perfectly organized life?" The question caught Edward completely off guard. He opened his mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. The uncomfortable truth was that he probably wouldn't be there if it weren't for Gabriel. Victoria represented exactly the kind of woman he thought he wanted. Emotionally independent, without complex emotional demands, satisfied with the social life that money could buy. Mariah saw the hesitation in his expression and nodded sadly. "That's what I thought." "But that doesn't mean I didn't love you," Edward said quickly. "Mariah, you were the only woman I ever truly loved." "Edward, loving someone and being ready for a life together are completely different things. You loved me when it was convenient, when I fit into the version of how you thought your life should be. But the moment I needed to be a real person, with real problems and real emotional needs, you pulled away." The accusation was harsh, but Edward couldn't deny it. During their marriage, he had treated Mariah more like a decorative piece in the life he had built than a true partner. Just then, Gabriel appeared at the balcony door. "Mommy, can I have some water?" "Of course, sweetie. I'll get it for you." Mariah went inside to get the water, leaving Edward alone with Gabriel for a few moments. The boy looked at him with childlike curiosity. "Are you my mommy's friend?" Gabriel asked. Edward knelt to be at the boy's level. "I've known your mum for a very long time. My mommy is really cool. She makes Mickey Mouse-shaped pancakes and reads stories with funny voices." Edward's heart broke a little as he imagined all the Sunday mornings, all the bedtime stories, all the small special moments he had missed. Mariah returned with the glass of water and noticed the expression on Edward's face. For a moment, her defenses wavered slightly. "Gabe, why don't you go watch some cartoons while Mommy finishes talking?" she suggested. When they were alone again, the silence between them had changed. It was less hostile, more melancholic. "I want to know him," Edward said finally. "I know I have no right to demand anything, but I'd like the chance to be his father." Mariah watched him for a long moment. "Edward, being a father isn't just about wanting to be one. It's about being there when he's sick in the middle of the night. It's having patience when he throws a tantrum at the grocery store. It's giving up your plans because he needs you. Are you sure you're ready for that?" "I don't know," Edward answered honestly, "but I'd like to try." The sincerity in his answer seemed to touch something in Mariah. "If you really want to try, we'll do this the right way, slowly, responsibly. Gabriel can't get hurt in this process." Edward nodded. "What do you suggest?" "First, you need to decide what you really want, whether it's just to satisfy your curiosity or if you truly want to build a relationship with him. Because, Edward, if you come into his life and then give up, you'll hurt a child who didn't ask to be born into this mess." "I understand." "Second, this will be at my pace, by my rules. Gabriel doesn't know who you are, and he won't until I'm sure you're committed to this for the long haul." Edward swallowed hard but agreed. "And what about us?" "Us?" Mariah laughed humorlessly. "Edward, there is no us. You're engaged to someone else, remember? And even if you weren't, too much has happened. I've changed, you've changed. If you want to get to know Gabriel, it's about him, not us." The answer hurt more than Edward expected, but he knew Mariah was right. He had made his choices and now he had to deal with the consequences. "When can I see him again?" he asked. "Next Saturday at Central Park, 3 o'clock. You can spend an hour with him in a public place, with me present. If it goes well, we can talk about gradually increasing the time." Edward nodded. An hour a week didn't seem like much, but it was a start. As he got up to leave, Gabriel came running from the living room. "Are you leaving?" "I am, but I'll see you again on Saturday." "Are you going to play with me at the park?" Edward looked at Mariah, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "I will." "Awesome." Gabriel smiled, and Edward felt something warm spread through his chest. Walking back to the elevator, Edward knew his life had completely changed in a matter of hours. He had a son, a smart, affectionate boy who carried half his genes, and he had a chance, however small, to make up for some of the lost time. But first, he had to deal with Victoria. He had to decide if he really wanted to marry someone for convenience, or if he was ready to fight for something real, even if it was painful and complicated. In the elevator on the way down, Edward looked at his reflection in the polished metal doors and wondered who the man looking back at him really was. Saturday arrived with an anxiety Edward hadn't felt in years. He had spent the entire week thinking about his meeting with Gabriel, researching online how to connect with a 2.5-year-old, and even buying toys he later deemed inappropriate. He was as nervous as a teenager on a first date. Victoria had noticed his distraction during the week, but Edward still hadn't found the courage to tell her the truth about what had happened at the hotel. Every time he tried to start the conversation, the words got stuck in his throat. How could he explain that he'd discovered he had a son without sounding like a complete deadbeat? At Central Park, Edward arrived 15 minutes early. He chose a bench near the playground and watched the families passing by. Fathers pushing strollers, children chasing kites, couples holding hands while watching their kids play. It was a world that had always existed around him, but one he had never paid attention to. When he saw Mariah approaching with Gabriel, his heart raced. The boy was wearing a blue t-shirt with a dinosaur on it and sneakers with lights that flashed with every step. In his free hand, he held a small toy airplane. "Edward!" Gabriel shouted when he saw him, running toward him with a child's natural excitement. For a moment, Edward was frozen. The natural impulse would be to open his arms and scoop the boy up, but he didn't know if that would be appropriate. Mariah noticed his hesitation and smiled slightly, the first sign of approval she had shown since their reunion. "Hey, champ," Edward said, kneeling to be at Gabriel's level. "That's a cool plane." "It's a jet," Gabriel explained seriously. "It flies super fast. Want to see?" Gabriel made the plane fly through the air, making engine noises with his mouth. Edward laughed genuinely, surprised at how something so simple could be so engaging. Mariah sat on the bench and watched them interact. She had spent the week questioning whether she was doing the right thing by letting Edward get close to Gabriel. On one hand, every child deserved to know their father. On the other, she feared Edward would back out once he realized how much fatherhood demanded of him. "Can we go to the playground?" Gabriel asked, already pulling Edward by the hand. Edward looked at Mariah, who nodded. "You can go. Just stay close to us." The playground was an explosion of colors and sounds. Gabriel headed straight for the slide, and Edward followed, trying to understand the dynamics of this little universe. Other children were playing everywhere, and Edward noticed how parents naturally interacted with their kids, pushing swings, helping with games, wiping noses, negotiating small tantrums. "Can you push me on the swing?" Gabriel asked, and Edward felt as if he'd been given an award. "Of course." Edward helped Gabriel onto the swing and began to push him gently. The boy's laughter was contagious, and Edward found himself smiling in a way he hadn't in a long time. "Higher," Gabriel requested. "Not too high," Mariah cautioned from the bench where she was sitting, and Edward realized that even while allowing this, she was still vigilant. After the swing, Gabriel wanted to show Edward how he could climb the jungle gym all by himself. Edward followed him like a protective shadow, his hands ready to catch any fall, not realizing he was already acting on paternal instinct. "Do you have kids?" asked a woman who was pushing a little girl on the swing next to them. The question caught Edward off guard. Yes, this is Gabriel." "First time at the park?" she continued, noticing his hesitation. "First time anywhere, really," Edward answered honestly, and immediately regretted his excessive sincerity. The woman smiled with understanding. "The first time, you always feel a little lost. But look how comfortable he is with you. Kids can sense when we're sincere." Edward looked at Gabriel, who was trying to convince him to play hide-and-seek behind the trees, and wondered if he was really being sincere or just trying to impress Mariah. When the hour was up, Gabriel threw a small tantrum. "Already? But I want to play more." "We agreed on just 1 hour, remember?" Mariah said patiently. "Edward can come play with you another day." "Promise?" Gabriel asked, looking directly at Edward. "I promise," Edward replied, feeling the weight of the word. A promise to a child was not something that could be broken lightly. On the way back to the car, Gabriel chatted about everything they had done at the playground, recounting each moment as if it had been the most exciting adventure of his life. Edward listened to every word, trying to commit the sound of his son's excited voice to memory. "He liked you," Mariah said when Gabriel got distracted chasing a butterfly. "How do you know?" "He won't stop talking. When Gabriel doesn't like someone, he gets quiet and clings to me." Edward felt a relief he didn't know he needed. "What about next week?" "Next week, you can take him for ice cream. 2 hours at the mall. I'll be in the food court, but you two can be alone at the ice cream shop." The progression felt huge to Edward. 2 hours alone with Gabriel represented real responsibility, not just a supervised playdate. "Mariah," he said when they reached her car, "thank you for this. I know it's not easy for you." Mariah watched him for a moment. "Edward, this isn't about me, it's about him. Just don't let me down." When Edward got home, Victoria was doing her nails in the living room, surrounded by wedding magazines spread across the sofa. "How was your Saturday?" she asked without looking up. Edward sat in the armchair across from her and took a deep breath. "Victoria, we need to talk." Something in his tone made her put down the nail file and look at him directly. "About what?" "About that woman in the elevator. About the boy who was with her." Victoria frowned. "Edward, you're scaring me. The boy is my son." The silence that followed was dense. Victoria blinked a few times as if trying to process information that made no sense. "What do you mean, he's your son?" "Mariah and I were married before I met you. When we separated, she was pregnant, but I didn't know. Gabriel is 2.5. Victoria shot up from the sofa. "You have a 2-year-old son and you never told me." "I didn't know he existed until this week." "And now you do. So what?" The question was direct but loaded with implications. Edward knew his answer would define not only the future of their relationship, but also the kind of man he chose to be. Now I want to know him. I want to be his father. Victoria crossed her arms, and Edward could see the calculations happening behind her eyes. Edward, this is a massive complication. A child changes everything. Our plans, our social life, our routine. I know. You know? She laughed humorlessly. Edward, we have a wedding in 4 months. 300 confirmed guests. My parents have already spent a fortune on the catering. I know it's complicated. Complicated? Victoria's voice rose. Edward, you're telling me you want to bring a child into our lives. A child you don't even know, from a woman you were once married to. This isn't complicated, it's insane. Edward stood up as well. Victoria, he's my son. And I'm your fiancée. Or does that mean nothing? The question hung in the air between them, and Edward realized he had reached the point of no return. He could see in Victoria's eyes the same thing he had always seen, the expectation that he would choose the most convenient, simplest, most socially acceptable option. It means a lot, he said calmly. But not enough. Victoria looked at him as if she'd been slapped. What is that supposed to mean? It means I fell in love with the idea of a perfect life with you. No complications, no drama, nothing to disrupt our elegant routine. But that's not real love, Victoria. That's convenience. And you're just realizing this now, after you ran into your ex-wife? Edward hesitated because the question was fair. Maybe I always knew, deep down, but I didn't have the courage to admit it. Victoria sat down again, more slowly this time. Edward could see that she was also coming to her own conclusions. You still love her, she stated. It wasn't a question. I don't know what I feel for her, Edward answered honestly. But I know I want the chance to find out, and most of all I know I want to know my son. Victoria was silent for a few minutes, fiddling with her engagement ring. When she finally spoke, her voice was calmer. I always knew you weren't completely present in this relationship, Edward. There was a part of you that always seemed to be somewhere else. Edward sat down again, surprised by her candor. I accepted it because our life together was elegant, functional, without any major emotional swings. But if you want to try for something real with someone else, if you want to be a father, then you're right. What we have isn't enough. The maturity in Victoria's response caught Edward off guard. He had prepared for yelling, accusations, maybe even a few broken plates. Instead, he found a resigned understanding that somehow hurt more. Victoria, I'm so sorry. Me too. She slipped the ring off her finger and placed it on the coffee table. But maybe it's better we figure this out now than 5 years from now, when we're bored with each other. Edward looked at the ring on the table, a nearly $200,000 diamond that symbolized a future that would never be real. What are we going to tell people? Victoria asked. The truth, that we realized we want different things out of life. And you're sure this is what you want? Because if you change your mind in a month, Edward, I won't be waiting. Edward thought of Gabriel playing on the playground, of the boys' genuine laughter, of the sense of purpose he had felt pushing him on the swing. He thought of Mariah, of the strong, independent woman she had become, of the courage she showed raising a son on her own. I'm sure. Victoria nodded and stood up. Then I'm going to my parents tonight. I'll come back for my things tomorrow. When she left, Edward was alone in the silent living room, staring at the ring glittering under the chandelier. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt truly free. He picked up his phone and typed a message to Mariah. I ended my engagement. When you have a moment, I'd like to talk to you about spending more time with Gabriel. The reply came 15 minutes later. Next Saturday, 2 hours at the mall, like we planned. We can talk about the next steps after that. Edward smiled. It was just a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. For the first time in 2.5 years, he was building something real instead of just keeping up appearances. And if that meant complications, drama, and the need to actually grow as a person, he was ready to face the challenge. 3 months had passed since that first meeting in the park, and the relationship between Edward and Gabriel had blossomed in a surprising way. What began as one-hour visits had turned into entire afternoons, then occasional weekends. Gabriel had started calling Edward Ed, an affectionate nickname that melted the tycoon's heart every time he heard it. Edward discovered sides of himself he never knew existed. He learned that Gabriel loved dinosaur stories, but was afraid of clowns. That the boy liked chocolate ice cream, but only if it didn't have any chunks in it. That Gabriel sang in the shower and always asked for 5 more minutes at bedtime. Each small discovery was a treasure to Edward, who felt like he was recovering precious pieces of a life he had almost lost forever. Even more surprising was how his relationship with Mariah had begun to transform. The initial ice had given way to cautious conversations about Gabriel, which eventually expanded to other topics. Edward learned that Mariah had won 3 awards for sustainable architecture in the last 2 years, that she was developing an innovative public housing project, and that she had become a leading voice in her field. The dependent woman he thought he had left behind had revealed herself to be an independent and respected professional. One Thursday afternoon, Edward was in his office reviewing contracts when his assistant, Robert, walked in, visibly disturbed. "Mr. Thompson, you need to see this," Robert said, holding out a tablet with an online article already open. The headline made Edward's blood run cold. "Architect uses son to blackmail millionaire ex-husband. Scandal rocks NYC real estate." Edward read the article with growing horror. The piece, published on a gossip website, painted Mariah as an opportunist who had hidden her pregnancy, only to later use Gabriel as a bargaining chip. It insinuated that she had orchestrated the chance encounter at the hotel to extort money from Edward. Worse, it suggested that her architectural projects had only been approved due to Edward's political influence. "Who's the source on this crap?" Edward demanded, his voice thick with anger. "Apparently someone close to the family. But, sir, there's more." Robert showed him other articles that had been published on different sites in the last few hours. They all followed the same narrative: Mariah as the vengeful ex-wife, Edward as the innocent victim, Gabriel as a pawn in a dirty game. Edward knew immediately who was behind it. Richard Vance, his minority partner at the firm, had been showing growing dissatisfaction with the company's new direction. Edward had started prioritizing sustainable projects and affordable housing, precisely the areas where Mariah was an expert, over the luxury developments that generated higher margins but had less social impact. Richard had questioned these decisions several times, always insinuating that Edward was being emotionally influenced by his ex-wife. The situation had escalated the previous week when Edward rejected a multi-million-dollar shopping mall project that would have destroyed a protected green space. Edward called Mariah immediately, but the call went straight to voicemail. He tried twice more with the same result. Deciding to go to her apartment in person, Edward left the office without telling anyone. In the New York traffic, he had far too much time to imagine how Mariah was feeling, how she was explaining the situation to Gabriel, whether she was crying or simply furious. When he arrived at her building, Edward found a small crowd of reporters at the entrance. Apparently, someone had leaked her address. Edward used the service entrance and managed to get to her apartment without being photographed. Mariah opened the door with red-rimmed eyes and a hardened expression. "Did you see?" "I saw everything. Mariah, I'm so sorry. I know who's doing this, and I'm going to stop it." "How are you going to stop it?" she asked, letting him in. Gabriel was asleep, seemingly oblivious to the chaos forming around his family. "Richard Vance, my partner. He wants to force me back to the old projects, and he's using you to do it." Mariah sank onto the sofa, looking defeated. "Edward, in 2 hours, I've gotten calls from 3 clients canceling projects. The Green Horizon condominiums, which was supposed to be my biggest contract of the year, is re-evaluating our partnership. My professional reputation is being destroyed because of lies." Edward sat next to her, maintaining a respectful distance, but desperately wanting to comfort her. "We're going to fix this. I'm holding a press conference tomorrow to deny everything." "And you think that will work?" "Edward, you don't understand. In the world of architecture, especially for a woman, reputation is everything. If people believe I use personal relationships to get projects, my career is over." The pain in her voice broke Edward's heart. Here was the same woman he had failed to protect 2.5 years ago, being attacked again because of her connection to him. "I won't let that happen," Edward said firmly. "Mariah, I made a lot of mistakes in the past. I let my pride and my cowardice hurt you, but I'm not going to repeat those mistakes." Mariah looked at him with a mixture of hope and skepticism. "What are you planning to do?" Edward already had a plan forming in his mind, but he knew it would be risky. "I'm going to expose Richard publicly. I'll show that this campaign against you is retaliation because he wants me to change the company's focus." "Edward, that could destroy your business." "Then let it be destroyed. You and Gabriel are more important." The statement hung in the air between them. It was the first time Edward had explicitly put their family above his business, and they both knew the weight of those words. That night, Edward didn't sleep. He spent hours preparing what he would say at the press conference, consulting with lawyers, and gathering evidence of Richard's sabotage. But mostly, he reflected on the kind of man he wanted to be from now on. The press conference was scheduled for the next day at the firm's headquarters. Edward had summoned all the major media outlets in the city, and the massive press turnout suggested the scandal had grown larger than he'd imagined. When Edward entered the room packed with journalists, camera flashes went off from every direction. He sat at the central table, took a deep breath, and began to speak without consulting any notes. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press, thank you for coming. You're here because despicable lies have been spread about the mother of my child, and I can no longer remain silent in the face of this injustice." A murmur went through the room. Edward had just publicly confirmed that Gabriel was his son. "Mariah Davis is the most talented architect I know. She won her projects on her own merit, long before our paths crossed again. The insinuations that she uses our past relationship to secure contracts are not only false, but deeply offensive to a professional who has built her career on dedication and competence." Edward paused, looking directly into the cameras. "During our marriage, I was a terrible husband. I was condescending, controlling, and emotionally absent. Mariah left me not for revenge or financial gain, but because I didn't deserve to be with such a strong woman. She discovered she was pregnant after our separation was already inevitable, and she made the brave decision to raise our son alone because I had proven I wasn't ready to be a father." The journalists were captivated. This was not the narrative they had been expecting. "In recent months, Mariah has given me the opportunity to get to know Gabriel and to learn how to be a father. She has not asked for money, sought advantages, or tried to blackmail me. On the contrary, she has set clear boundaries to protect our son from any instability." Edward stood up, walking toward the cameras. "The smear campaign against Mariah is being orchestrated by people who want to force me to abandon socially responsible projects in favor of developments that generate higher profits. Richard Vance, my now former partner, has made it clear on several occasions that he disapproves of the sustainable direction our company has been taking." Edward knew he had just declared war, but he continued. "I am here today, not only to defend Mariah, but to announce a definitive shift in our company's philosophy. From now on, 60% of our projects will be dedicated to affordable housing and environmental sustainability. Richard Vance is being removed from all executive duties at the company." The room erupted with shouted questions, but Edward raised a hand for silence. "Finally, I want to say something to Mariah, who I know is watching." Edward looked directly into the main camera. "You are an extraordinary woman, an exceptional mother, and a brilliant professional. Any client who cancels a contract with you because of this smear campaign will be missing the opportunity to work with the best architect in New York City." Edward paused again, and when he spoke next, his voice was thick with emotion. "And Gabriel, if you ever watch this one day, I want you to know that your daddy is learning to be the man that you and your mommy deserve. You two are the best thing that has ever happened to me." The room was silent for a few seconds before exploding with questions. Edward answered a few, always reinforcing Mariah's professional competence and his own personal transformation. When the press conference ended, Edward knew he had changed his life forever. Richard would likely file a series of lawsuits. Some traditional clients might pull away. His reputation in the conservative business community was probably ruined. But for the first time in years, Edward felt truly whole. His cell phone rang as soon as he left the press room. It was Mariah. "Edward, have you gone completely insane?" "Probably," he answered, "but it was the right thing to do." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Thank you," she said simply. "Mariah, can I see you today? There are more things I need to tell you." "Edward, you just blew up your career for me. I think you've said enough." "No," Edward said, stopping in the middle of the bustling hallway of his office building. "Actually, I think I'm finally starting to say the right things." That afternoon, major news sites replayed clips from the press conference. Mariah Davis became a trending topic on Twitter, with thousands of people defending her professional competence. Several renowned architects published messages of support, but Edward knew the true test of his strategy's success would be whether Mariah could keep her clients and her reputation intact. He had put all his cards on the table. Now all he could do was wait and see if it would be enough to fix the mistakes of the past and build a future worth having. Gabriel was too young to fully understand what was happening. But that night, when Edward went to visit them, the boy said something that would be etched in his memory forever. "Ed, Mommy said you were really brave today." Edward hugged his son, breathing in the scent of baby shampoo in his soft hair, and knew that he was finally on the right path to being the father and the man they deserved. 2 weeks after the press conference, the results of Edward's bold move began to materialize in ways neither of them had anticipated. The U.S. Attorney's Office had opened an investigation into irregularities in some of the construction firm's older projects, precisely the ones Richard had insisted on keeping. Apparently, the public exposure had encouraged other suppliers and employees to report questionable practices that had been covered up for years. Richard, desperate and cornered, had tried one last gambit, leaking the company's financial data to the press, attempting to show that Edward was driving the firm into bankruptcy with his social projects. The strategy backfired when the numbers revealed the exact opposite. The sustainable projects were generating consistent profits and attracting international investors interested in corporate social responsibility. Edward was in his office that Friday morning, reviewing contracts for 3 new affordable housing developments, when Robert entered with an expression that mixed astonishment and satisfaction. "Mr. Thompson, Ms. Davis is downstairs and she has a delegation with her." Edward frowned. "A delegation?" "Looks like they're from the mayor's office. There's an official car and everything." Intrigued, Edward went down to meet Mariah in the lobby. She was elegantly dressed in a navy blue suit, carrying a leather portfolio, and accompanied by 3 people Edward vaguely recognized from the city's Department of Housing. "Edward," Mariah greeted him formally, but there was a sparkle in her eyes that hinted at something important. "I'd like to introduce the Commissioner of Housing, Dr. Charles Miller, the coordinator of Sustainable Projects, Dr. Annabelle Scott, and the Urban Planning Advisor, Frank Lewis." Edward greeted them all, still trying to understand what was happening. The Commissioner spoke first. "Mr. Thompson, we're here to present a proposal. The city is launching the largest sustainable public housing program in North America. It involves 50,000 housing units to be built over the next 5 years, all following strict criteria for environmental sustainability and social impact." Edward felt his heart race. A project of this magnitude would be transformative not only for his company, but for thousands of New York families. "Architect Mariah Davis will be the general coordinator of the architectural design," the Commissioner continued, "and she has recommended your firm as the primary construction partner based on your recent track record in social projects and the integrity you've demonstrated publicly." Edward looked at Mariah, who maintained a professional expression, but he could see the quiet satisfaction in her eyes. In 2 weeks, she had not only reclaimed her reputation, but had landed the most important project of her career. "Of course, there will be a formal bidding process," the project coordinator added, "but Ms. Davis's recommendation carries significant weight, considering she will be overseeing the entire execution." After the city delegation left, Edward and Mariah were alone in the lobby. For a moment, they just looked at each other, as if processing the magnitude of what had just happened. "Mariah, this is incredible. You managed to turn this whole situation into an opportunity." "We did," she corrected him. "Edward, your press conference changed everything. It not only cleared my name, but positioned me as a professional with integrity in an industry rife with corruption. The offers started pouring in the next day. Edward shook his head, still impressed. You deserve every opportunity. I only regret that it took me so long to defend you publicly. Mariah smiled, the first truly warm smile she had given him since their reunion. People change, Edward, and you've proven that you have. Mariah, Edward said, feeling the time had come to be completely honest. Can I take you to dinner, just the two of us? There are things I need to tell you. She hesitated for a moment. What about Gabriel? Can your mom watch him for one night? I'd like to talk to you without any interruptions. Mariah agreed, and they made plans for Saturday night. Edward spent the next day as anxious as a teenager, changing his outfit 3 times and mentally rehearsing what he would say. The restaurant he chose was discreet but elegant on the Upper East Side. Mariah arrived wearing a simple yet sophisticated black dress, and Edward remembered how she always managed to look stunning without any ostentation. During dinner, they talked about Gabriel, about their professional projects, about how they had both changed in recent years. The conversation flowed naturally, without the tension and resentment that had marked their first few encounters. Mariah, Edward said when dessert was served, I know I've apologized several times, but I need you to fully understand how much I regret the way things ended between us. Edward, we don't need to rehash the past. Yes, we do, because I want you to know the man I've become. Edward leaned forward. When we were married, I thought loving someone meant protecting them from life's difficulties. I thought if I made enough money, if I controlled all the variables, I could create a perfect bubble for you. Mariah listened intently, fiddling with a ring on her middle finger. But I didn't understand that you didn't want to be protected. You wanted to be supported. You wanted a partner who believed in your abilities, who would stand by you during challenges, not someone who tried to eliminate them. Edward, let me finish, please. He took a deep breath. Gabriel taught me what unconditional love is. That child loves me even when I don't understand his games, even when I ask silly questions, even when I'm clumsy. He taught me that loving someone is accepting them exactly as they are and supporting them in becoming who they want to be. Mariah's eyes were glistening, but she let Edward continue. And you, Mariah, you taught me that courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about doing the right thing even when you're terrified. You raised Gabriel alone, built a brilliant career, and maintained your integrity even when I completely let you down. You are the bravest person I know. Edward took a small box from his pocket and placed it on the table between them. Mariah looked at the box, then at him, her expression a mix of surprise and something that might have been hope. I know you don't need me, Mariah. You've already proven you're capable of having a full and happy life without me. But I would be deeply honored to walk beside you, as your true partner, as Gabriel's father, as someone who admires and supports you in everything you want to achieve. Edward opened the box, revealing a ring very different from the one he had given Victoria. It was more delicate, with a smaller but exceptionally high-quality diamond, in a design reminiscent of intertwined leaves, a clear nod to Mariah's work in sustainable architecture. Mariah Davis, will you marry me? Not because you have to, but because we choose to build a family. Based on respect, admiration, and true love? Mariah looked at the ring, then at Edward, and he could see a battle of emotions on her face. Fear, hope, love, caution, all mixed into an expression that broke his heart. Edward, she said finally, her voice a little shaky, what if it doesn't work out again? What if you go back to being that man who wants to control everything? Then you leave me again, Edward answered simply. Mariah, I can't promise I'll be perfect, but I can promise that when I make mistakes I will own them, apologize, and do whatever it takes to fix them. And most of all, I can promise that I will fight every single day to be the man that you and Gabriel deserve. Mariah held out a trembling hand, and Edward slid the ring onto her finger. Yes, she whispered, and then louder, yes, I accept. Edward stood up and kissed her, right there in the middle of the restaurant, under the curious gazes of other diners. It was a kiss that tasted of second chances, of maturity, of promises that would be kept. When they pulled apart, they were both crying and smiling at the same time. "Gabriel is going to be ecstatic," Mariah said, wiping away her tears. "He already knows," Edward admitted. "I asked for his permission yesterday." "You did what?" "I asked him if he'd like Ed to become his real daddy, forever. He said yes, but only if I promised to make dinosaur-shaped pancakes." Mariah laughed, a genuine laugh that Edward hadn't heard in years. "And did you promise?" "Obviously. I've already been looking up recipes." In the months that followed, they built their new life together with a maturity that hadn't existed in their first marriage. Edward truly learned to share domestic and parental responsibilities. Mariah learned to trust that he wouldn't disappear at the first sign of trouble. Gabriel gained not only a present father, but a family that functioned on communication and respect. The public housing project became a national success, serving as a model for other cities. Edward and Mariah worked together as equal partners, each contributing their expertise, creating developments that were both profitable and socially responsible. Richard was eventually prosecuted for corruption and racketeering in public bids. Edward felt no satisfaction in his former partner's imprisonment, only relief at having distanced himself from that world of unethical business. The wedding was simple but emotional, held in the same park where Edward had met Gabriel for the second time. The boy, then 3.5, was the proudest ring-bearer in history, carrying the wedding bands on a dinosaur-shaped pillow he had picked out himself. During the ceremony, when the officiant asked if they took each other as partners in joy and in sorrow, Edward looked into Mariah's eyes and saw not just the woman he loved, but the extraordinary mother of his son, the brilliant professional he admired, the companion who had chosen to walk beside him of her own free will. "I do," he said, and this time he knew exactly what he was promising. 2 years later, on a Sunday afternoon, Edward was in the backyard of the new house they had bought together, a house big enough for Gabriel to play in, but cozy enough to be a real home. He was pushing Gabriel on the swing while Mariah finished planting white roses in the flower bed. "Ed, can you push me higher?" Gabriel asked, and Edward smiled, remembering the first time he had heard that request. "Of course, champ." As he pushed the swing, Edward looked over at Mariah, who was now wearing a loose blouse that discreetly hid her 5-month baby bump. They had recently found out that Gabriel was getting a little sister, and the boy was absolutely thrilled with the idea of being a big brother. "Mariah," Edward called out, "remember what you told me that first day about me not being ready to be a father?" Mariah looked up from the roses and smiled. "I remember. Thank you for giving me the chance to prove you wrong." "I wasn't wrong," Mariah replied, walking toward them. "Back then, you really weren't ready. But people grow, Edward. People learn, people change." Gabriel jumped off the swing and ran to hug Mariah's legs. "Mummy, can I feel the baby kick?" "You can, sweetie." Edward watched as Mariah knelt, so Gabriel could place his small hand on her belly, patiently explaining that his little sister was still very small, but that soon he could help take care of her. In that moment, Edward fully understood what it meant to have a family. It wasn't about controlling or protecting or just providing. It was about being present, about growing together, about choosing each other every day, even when, especially when, things got hard. The elevator in that luxury hotel had changed his life forever, but not in the way he had initially thought. It wasn't the shock of the discovery that transformed him, but the slow, sometimes painful journey of learning to be a father, a husband, and a true partner. As the sun began to set, they went inside together. Gabriel ran to the living room to organize his toys. Mariah went to start dinner, and Edward stood for a moment in the doorway watching his family. His real family built on a solid foundation of respect, mature love, and conscious choices. Finally, Edward Thompson had learned that true success wasn't measured in money or power, but in the ability to love and be loved in return. And by that measure, he was the richest man in the world.